Robert Redford, thank you very much for joining us. There is a line near the beginning of your new movie where your character says something along the lines of journalism is practically dead when he meets a journalist. Is that what you think?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I have to be careful answering it talking to a journalist. But I mean, I think the character. There's a little bit of difference between how I feel and how the character feels. I think the character was being cynical because I think he was on guard. I think the character was on guard because the journalist came to him, and already the journalist had shown signs of being a little too aggressive. So right away that evoked a defensive posture. So I think that was more extreme than I feel. No, I don't think it's dead. And I think if it's dead, then we all die. Because I think journalism is essential to any culture, particularly to our culture. So I feel so strongly about its importance that I take it seriously and as an artist, would put a critical eye on it. Say, well, how is it doing? How is it being? What does it look like? I mean, that's what All the President's Men was about. What is it like? It wasn't about Nixon. It wasn't about what history would do with that event. It was about the hard work these two journalists did, and I wanted to tell that story to show how hard it was to get the truth at that time. Now, times have changed. What does it look like today? And then what you do is you run the risk of maybe offending some journalists if you try to tell a story that shows a more complex side of it. You might affect a thin-skinned journalist who says, well, then who are you to tell us what it's about?
Well, what do you think?
What I think is that journalism, which is so vital, so important, has run up against what the internet has done. The internet has democratized information so much that for the public sitting out there trying to find out where the truth is, they get all these voices, Twitter, tweets. You get internet. It's such a multiplicity of noises and sounds and voices. How is the common person to know where the truth is, particularly when some of those voices are lying? We have voices in America who are on public stations just lying, and so but they pretend it's the truth. So what do you do with that? And I think there's nothing wrong with having a film look at that issue. Not that this film does that much, but it makes a person like my character wary. There's too many voices out there, and so times have changed.
I mean, there's a bit of exasperation in the character, I suppose, with journalism, and the journalist in the movie goes through a sort of a journey himself as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
And I just wonder if that's what you're seeking, what you want to happen, particularly with the American media.
It is. To me, I'm more interested in the gray area in America. I think America, in the country that I've grown up in and looked at carefully as I watched things develop, it's a country that tends to want to reduce things to just black and white, or blue and red and blue. To me, there's a more complex area that doesn't get a lot of attention, is the gray area. And that's always what interests me. Where does the complexity lie in our country? It's still a country I love, but I also love it enough to, as an artist, want to put a critical eye on changes that take place. So that's what this film does. It puts a critical eye. And by the way, it's not about the time that this event happened 30 years ago. It's about now. It's about those people who made a choice to protect their freedoms. They took on a false identity to go underground, to escape the FBI and journalism. And then what has been the cost of that? 30 years later, when times change and they change, what's been the cost to them over that time that separates them from that particular time? But they're tied together because of their commitment.
You're a very political artist, and I wonder, do you remember the point at which you decided to be open about your political feelings? It was a pretty risky thing to do for an actor, isn't it?
I guess so. I don't know that I ever decided to be open about it. I think it was primarily in the work. It goes pretty well all the way back. But it has a lot to do with more fundamental themes. I mean, for me, a more fundamental theme was the hunter and the hunted. And you could go all the way back, I suppose, to films like Willie Boy, Butch Cassidy, All the President's Men, even Quiz Show. I mean, if you look hard at those pieces, there has always been the hunter and the hunted. So obviously, I think that theme is a very strong one. artistically. When it also falls neatly into politics, because journalists are out to get a story, and usually the people they're after to get the story from don't want to reveal, so there's that tension. I think, well, that can be dramatic if you do it right.
Have you been punished at all for revealing your politics? I mean, modern day actors don't really do it very much, do they? I mean, other than on very safe issues. We're all against terrorism and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I think we are, yeah, we're certainly against terrorism, but yeah, I have, particularly early on, particularly on the environment, when I spoke out against corporate manipulation of our natural resources. I got hammered pretty good. There was very small category of supporters for the environment back in 1968, 9. And so my voice got kicked around pretty good.
You've been sort of critical of Barack Obama recently.
What did I say?
Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the impression you thought he had not necessarily delivered what he had promised.
Well, I don't think he has, but I don't think it's entirely his fault, because what is he up against? He's up against a brick wall on the other side. I mean, look, if you look at the term politics, what does politics mean by definition? It's the art of compromise. So obviously compromise has to be part of the program. If you have two sides of the aisle not working together, you have no compromise and you have no progress. So the guy comes in, he tries to do the right thing, he tries to give it to the other side and say, let's work together. But what he was unprepared for was the rigidity and the ideological backwardness of the other side. Their only action was to defeat him in any way that they could. I mean, that's such a narrow, kind of ugly point of view, but what it did, what we watched, he thought he could win them over. And he took a whole first term to realize that he couldn't. I thought a lot of time was wasted. I also think because of the person he is, he's a centrist. His whole life has been built around being in the center, not one side or the other. To being a community organizer, you have to work with both sides. I understand that. He's obviously very gifted. I think he's a very highly principled man. I think he's got enormous integrity. He's got enormous dignity. But he's in a war zone, and it's very difficult to maintain those attributes when you're fighting against people that are just not willing to give you anything at all. And I think it's been hard for him to adjust to that reality.
Speaking of war zone, I mean, I had a slightly odd run-in with Quentin Tarantino earlier this year, talking about movie violence. And I wonder what your view was of movie violence, because clearly the White House have tried to bring in the Hollywood studios and talk about it as an issue. Do you think there is any... I mean, do you think Hollywood needs to change its behaviour at all in terms of violence? And do you think there's any link between violence and movie violence?
I don't know that there's a link. I suspect there is. Violence is... Well, first of all, violence has been in our culture since its beginning. It's not likely to go away because it's so integral to our society. It's just part of the deal. Films have always portrayed violence, but they portrayed violence in different ways at different times. For example, in the 30s, when there was a depression, people were suffering. A lot of the films that Warner Brothers made, Public Enemy and Little Caesar, were enormously violent. And then things changed. So like when you had, Rock Hudson and Doris Day making these happy movies. You know, there wasn't any violence there, but that's because it was a different time. So I think the times are reflected in film. Right now, I think because of video games and because of the youth market and what would appeal to youth, I think violence has been accentuated. I think too much. I do think too much. Do I think there's a connection, considering the fact that violence is part of our culture, whether we like it or not? Probably, but it's not for me to make that decision or that investigation. I suspect that look, when I was a little kid, I loved comic books. And I had to go into a closet to read a comic book because my parents would get all upset that I was reading comic books. I thought they were great. I read Captain Marvel. I read, I read all that stuff, Batman. And then I wasn't supposed to be allowed to go see Frankenstein, the movie Frankenstein. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, because it was of the violence. Well, I had to sneak in. I mean, I just had to get in there, So I understand how young people feel about violence and how it might be attractive, but I think it probably has gone too far. And I think something probably should be answered for, but I'm not the one to ask the question.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your time, and good luck with your documentary as well.
Thank you.